Horror has been a staple genre that I've grown to become more invested with over the years. It's a genre that produces a strange blend of provocative terror and critical reflection, confronting certain fears that we all carry personally and universally, if done well. This strange fascination for arousing fear into the hearts of the engaged viewer is something that has transcended across multiple art forms, ranging from literature, cinema, and even video games. So with virtual reality becoming more mainstream by the day, along with more filmmakers and game developers using this art form for their works, I'm drawn to what this could mean with enhancing the ever-evolving world of horror. Primarily, I'm fascinated with what techniques virtual reality can carry over from preceding art forms, and how these techniques make horror pieces published under this kind of experience medium-specific. This ultimately leads me to ask, in what way does our immersion towards horror become enhanced through virtual reality, and what could this mean for the future of presenting the genre overall? Before I dive neck deep into the world of VR horror, I like to take a moment to look back at what made this genre work in other forms of visual media, starting with film. Horror has been established in that art form since the early days of cinema, with films ranging from the silent era, such as the 1922 German expressionist film Nosferatu, to works from the mid to late 20th century, and now to more contemporary works, which roughly generalizes to anything from Blumhouse production. The fascinating nature about horror in films is how their storylines, to an extent, reflect upon what drives fear within certain regions of the world. For instance, with films based in the United States, we're likely going to see narratives incorporating the idea of an unwanted entity intruding upon private spaces or bodies, while films centered around Korean culture tend to follow around familial hierarchies and the violation of these systems. Of course, these fears change alongside their respective regions over time, yet despite these narrative differences, there's a common factor that establishes horror in these films. I ultimately refer to the camera and the mise-en-scène as essential for capturing horror. To the viewer, what we observe within the frame is essential for the overall presentation of horror. This sense of dread derives from the character's relation to the space, both contextually and visually. If we want to examine how we build horror within the environment, there's a sort of formula for how film directors of that genre do so, especially with found footage films. This formula generally centers around taking a familiar environment presented earlier in the film, only to later twist this familiarity into a nightmarish state that challenges the characters and viewers' sense of comfort. For instance, the Blair Witch Project spends Act 1 establishing Coffin Rock as a forest centered around the legend of the Blair Witch. American video game designer Richard Rouse III mentions in his essay about video game horror that horror presents a familiar world, but with enough of a twist to make it seem fantastic and special. Horror stories are typically set in highly recognizable locations that players can identify, but which have been invaded by some evil force. This force has often altered the rules of the world in some way. Tension centered around Coffin Rock is established through the dialogue sprinkled around the first quarter of the film. Over time, Coffin Rock evolves into a lingering threat that preys upon everyone going insane, with the supernatural forces of force becoming more oppressive over time. The repetition of these threats ultimately climax to Coffin Rock fulfilling the lore established around it, thus bringing a narratively grand end to the characters and a sound conclusion for the audience. Now, if we want to talk about the film's visual aesthetics, the Blair Witch Project does an interesting yet common approach to constructing the environment for the viewer. The forest itself doesn't visually evoke fear initially. For people who've spent time relaxing in nature especially, there's a sense of familiarity established through the visually calming atmosphere the environment carries. Despite the characters being lost and going at each other's throats, nothing within the environment stands out as directly threatening to the viewer, especially during the day. However, once darkness becomes a dominant factor within the film, that's when the horror picks up. I'm highlighting darkness because of its role in creating spatial relations between the subject and the environment. When we find these characters traversing within dark spaces, our awareness of the environment becomes obscured and we feel that the world is smaller than it actually appears on camera. The ratio between subject and darkness presents an artificial sense of claustrophobia to the space. There's a sense of unpredictability that's associated with the dark, and we become anxious of the consequences if we, along with the characters, fall victim to the space.
Flames are licking you like the devil there, Josh.
Within the world of horror cinema, the way the filmmaker presents their fictional environment plays a major role for producing fear. The world becomes a threatening force that serves to break down that sense of calmness and security embodied in not just the film, but also us as the audience. It finally becomes the choice of the editor and director to determine which shots are essential in the final cut of the film in order to make us feel properly tense and uneasy.
All I want to do is get out of here, man. I'm not f***ing around.
That's all I want too, man.
With video games, there's a fundamental difference with how we depict horror in comparison to film. That difference is the amount of agency the player has over the camera and, subsequently, the characters we project onto. The luxury of horror games is that we have more agency to determine where we direct the camera. In film, the director limits our immersion to what we're allowed to see, based on their distinct selection of shots. However, outside of pre-scripted cinematics, the player ultimately has control over how their characters interact, move, and perceive their environment. They ultimately take the role of the director in these games. Of course, the player's agency depends on the parameters set by the developers, primarily in terms of how much we're able to control what we can sense in the environment. For instance, in older horror games that implement the fixed camera frame, such as earlier entries from the Silent Hill franchise, our perception of the environment becomes limited and obscured. Transitioning between different areas within the environment leaves us anxious to whatever potential threats lay hidden outside of our established point of view. Through this, we as the player become limited with how much we can move and look within the space, and consequently, we become more vulnerable to threats that may arise unexpectedly because of the camera's framing. With more recent games where the player is given more freedom to move their camera, game developers fall under the challenge of determining how to guide the player into certain cues that will produce that feeling of dread in the most natural way possible. In the worst case scenario, the player could completely miss critical events that add flavor to their horror experience. This solution ultimately comes from the aid of environmental design. Frictional Games' Amnesia: The Dark Descent makes excellent use of the environmental space to immerse and coerce the player into a consistent state of dread. Throughout the game, the player must travel through the halls of Castle Brennenburg, all while trying not to succumb to the oppressive darkness and various threats that are present. We exist through a first-person point of view, allowing us to directly convey what's present within the world through Daniel, the game's protagonist, based on what he's able to see and hear. The balance between light and darkness plays a huge role in creating this kind of vulnerability within the environment. Similar to cinema, decorating an environment with overwhelming amounts of darkness brings a sense of confinement to the space. At certain points, game designers will use a mixture of light and non-diegetic audio cues to guide players towards certain objectives. On the other hand, we may also be forced to move through poorly lit environments that obscure our line of sight. As a result, the world insists that we become more cautious of the potential threats that are seemingly hidden from us. And when certain diegetic cues interrupt a monotonous soundscape, that's when we become even more alert and conscious that our safety within the space is about to come under threat. The inescapable notion that danger could exist anywhere, even without visually perceiving such, is what ultimately makes us vulnerable, cornered, and trapped within a familiar environment that tends to function against our survivability. This kind of terror occurs when we've dug into our primitive nature for survival as we try to retreat to safety, only to find ourselves feeling even more trapped. Resource management becomes a major gameplay element when determining how much the player is able to comfortably perceive their environmental space, whether that means traveling under the safety of light or anticipating the possibility of danger hidden out of view. The failure of proper management places us into a state of vulnerability, where traveling within these dark spaces implies a hindrance of progression under the neglect of the player.
I've been there. I deserve this.
With horror games giving players more freedom to explore and interact within the world, we'd think that we've hit a point in visual media where the viewer has reached the fullest level of immersion the world has to offer. But there is a limit to how much immersion the player can receive within this medium. Since earlier forms of visual media, there's a fine displacement between the viewer and the screen. In film, we are looking at these characters from a safe distance between reality and fiction. We can never become fully immersed in a film because the space we occupy in reality is going to be inherently different from the world presented to us. Consequently, we can hardly empathize completely with what the characters we watch are feeling, mostly because our understanding of these people derive from the subjective interpretation to how they appear to us in frame. In film, we primarily take the role of the omniscient viewer, watching these people struggle out of fear, and we take no responsibility for their suffering. We may sympathize with these characters, but we can hardly say we could actually become them.
They're here.
To a degree, video games close this gap with how the player embodies a character through gameplay. However, the issue of immersion follows the same problems as cinema, our displacement between the viewer and the character. For games that revolve around a third-person point of view, we still play the role of an omniscient entity to the characters we control. This means that we don't necessarily embody these characters, but instead project onto who they are and how they exist within the game environment. And even if we focused on games incorporating first-person gameplay, we still have the same issues that film has with the viewer's displacement from the monitor. Ultimately, just like films, we have the option where we can look away from the fictional world presented to us and retreat to the safe confines of our reality. Within virtual reality, the frame becomes non-existent and is replaced with a complete 360-degree view of the space. Rather than being disassociated between us and the frame, we achieve a distinct level of immersion that surpasses that of film and traditional video games. Though, through VR, the camera and our perspective completely merge, and we become completely incorporated into the fictional landscape. This idea of the frameless space has been an idea that's been toyed around with horror filmmakers and game developers alike. In 2018, a pair of Swedish filmmakers, Henrik Leichenstring and Sofia Gillstorm, released a short VR piece titled 1157. This film centers around the viewer being tied down in a basement, eventually finding themselves confronted by threatening entities that appear for no logical rhyme or reason. Regarding the thought process behind using VR, Gillstrom mentions in an interview with Fast Company how she sees the audience as always a spectator watching a film, but Oculus Rift opens up the opportunity to actually be in the film. So naturally, they wanted to make the viewer the main character. When watching this film, our movement is limited to a static point within the basement. Our perception of the environment gets interrupted through the occasional blackout. However, the visual and auditory landscape constantly puts us in a state of awareness that there's another character sharing the same space as us. As the viewer, we make use of the limited lighting to direct our focus towards these threats moving throughout the basement. Our anxiety becomes heightened when these characters approach us with extreme close-ups to intrude in our personal space. Heinrich and Sophia prey upon our vulnerability throughout the duration of the film, as they acknowledge that the viewer is helpless and simply unable to do anything but endure these unsettling confrontations. This presentation, set within an immersive panoramic space, marks the potential of how we can further transform horror into something even more confrontational to the viewer. And in addition to filmmakers, game developers experimenting with virtual reality over the past few years have been making notable advancements with incorporating elements of horror into their works. As the player, we can finally identify with the characters we embody to the fullest level of agency and immersion granted to us within the parameters of the game. This amount of control then puts the player fully responsible for their actions, thus making them further vulnerable to the consequences of danger or failure. One notable VR game that incorporates horror to this kind of heightened immersion is Dreadhalls by White Door Games. Dreadhalls is an Amnesia-inspired dungeon crawler set to VR, where the player must traverse through dark corridors to escape, all while avoiding the heart attack-inducing enemies that appear unpredictably within the area. Now, when I mention Dreadhalls as an Amnesia-inspired game, I mean that they carry some of the same gameplay mechanics, along with similar layout designs revolving around darkness and confined spaces. If you put gameplay from these two games side by side, on the surface, you could almost expect an equivalent horror experience. However, what sets Dreadhalls functionally different from Amnesia is the benefit of incorporating VR as a means of bringing the player closer to the horror presented. Similar to 1157, the player absorbs the world through a frameless camera that functions under our physical control. The displacement between the viewer and the fictional world becomes virtually non-existent because of our embodiment within the space. And similar to Amnesia, there are random sound cues incorporated into the game's ambience, regardless if any monsters are actually approaching, to build onto the threatening premise of the game environment. Our experience with danger then is more confrontational, as they become threatening to us because of how we and these encounters virtually coexist within the same surroundings, whether we see them or not. In the end, Dread Halls expands further on how amnesia makes the player feel more vulnerable through this heightened progression of immersion. The ultimate result from these VR pieces is that our experiences truly become our own, rather than a mere projection onto another character, as an accumulation of common elements that have made horror effective in other art forms. VR takes a quantitatively new perspective to how we consume visual media belonging to this genre. Unless you find yourself ripping off your headset to cop out from the experience, virtual reality offers us the chance to experience films and games in a way that heightens our idea of horror to a new and immersive level. Now, of course, I haven't seen every bit of media related to horror yet to stay 100% true to what I'm saying, and I'll probably shift with what I've said over time. Furthermore, there are definitely more elements within each piece of visual work that engages with horror in their own distinct ways, which I would be happy to take the time to go further into in the future. Nevertheless, virtual reality is becoming more practical for filmmakers and more mainstream for gamers. Thanks to better technology for both production and consumption, this art form is even more accessible to the domestic consumer. And as a fanatic for terror, I look forward to seeing what's more in store with future filmmakers and game developers incorporating VR into their works, especially within the world of horror.